Hello and welcome to this requested video where we're going to take a look at importing MIDI files. So there's a few levels to this. So this is prompted by a viewer who's having problems importing MIDI files into Cubase and getting a multi-timbral Halion Sonic setup achieved. So that's what we're going to look at first. And then we're going to look at a couple of things to take you to the next level as far as your MIDI importing is concerned. So first things first, this should go back to certainly all modern versions of Cubase, but there is a setting which is important. So we're going to visit that. So because I'm on Mac, I'm going to go to Cubase and then Preferences. I think on Windows, it's under Edit and then Preferences. But we're going to go to MIDI file on the left-hand side. So go to MIDI first if you need to, and then MIDI file. Now, this is the important setting here. So you need to make sure that the destination is set to Halion Sonic SE multi-timbral. Now, I'll be honest, I don't normally have it set to that. I normally have it set to just instrument tracks, and then I set each track individually. But for our purposes here, this is what we want. Any of the other options, I would leave them as they are set here. So set them this way if they're not set like that, and then it should follow exactly as it is on screen. Generally, these are fairly sane, but occasionally there's some things you want to do. A couple of these could be useful often, but we will look at ways to get around them later on. So once you've got that set, next thing to do is to import the MIDI file. Now, in this case, I'm going to be using Flourish, which is a track. If you're on Windows, you already have this. It's a little known fact that in the Windows installation, you have a few media files to play with. And I think this goes back to Windows 95. It certainly goes back a long way. But anyway, on the hard drive that you've got Windows installed on, you will have a Windows folder. In that folder, you will have a media folder. In there, you'll have 3 MIDI files, which will be Flourish, One Stop, and Town, I believe. So we're going to import Flourish. You're not going to hear much of it just to avoid any possibility of having a copyright strike, but that's one we're going to be working with. If you're on a Mac, you can import this file. You can download it from the internet. It's really easy to find. I'll put a link in the description of where I found it from in this particular case. It's easy enough to import. You just go to File, Import, and MIDI file. Pick the MIDI file in question. So there's Flourish, and just click Open. And it will ask you for a location. So I'm going to put it in its own folder inside Requests. So I'm going to call it MIDI file import because that's the kind of guy I am, and click Open. And there we have it. Okay, so we've got the salient things is we've got our MIDI track. So you see typically you get one MIDI track which is set to any, and then you will get potentially up to 16. So here you can see we've got 15. We could have had 16, but we don't. Those are all the individual instruments. And then we've got a VST instruments folder with a Halion Sonic SE, and Halion Sonic SE is doing all of the work in this case. So if we open it up by whatever route we like, we're going to open it up via the right zone today. We can see that all of these sounds have been appropriately set. So this was one of the topics of debate with the viewer in question, and this is what Halion Sonic is set to do. So it imports the General MIDI program changes, which we're going to look at in a little more detail in a minute, and then you should be ready to go. So there's a couple of little tweaks we need to look at, but generally, once that's happened, you should be in a position to play the track back. So just going to zoom out a bit vertically and then play just a little bit of it. So there we have the joy of Flourish. I won't play the whole thing for a number of reasons. But it's generally, it's a fairly nicely programmed bit of MIDI. It's not just all, velocity, 127, etc. So there's a few nice little bits in there. And it's been quite nicely done. It's a reasonable demo of what MIDI can actually sound like if you just give it a bit of a chance. So that's the basics of importing a MIDI track. So what we're going to look at in the next section is how to, in air quotes, upgrade the sounds from those basic general MIDI sounds to something else. We're going to look at a couple of things you need to do that. So with the basic general MIDI import, what happens is that the MIDI file has things called program changes in. Now, program changes were I wouldn't say all the rage, but a fairly common thing back in the day, particularly when hardware synths were the default. Now, pretty much everybody now, the default is to have software synths, and program changes are much less of a thing because generally you will pick your programs by picking a menu, whether it's in an inspector, as in on Cubase, or it's on the synth itself. You're not limited to 128 program changes. I know there's some exceptions to that on MIDI instruments, but the idea of sending a program change has generally fallen by the wayside, and that can lead to some problems because if you're not aware of how this system works, you're not aware of how you can fix things when they go wrong, etc. So we're just going to look at it, how it works in this particular case. So if we open up our Halion Sonic, we can see that on our first track on MIDI channel 1, we've got program GM90, which is pad 2 warm. Now, all of these are GM. You can see it says GM, and GM stands for General MIDI. It was an attempt by multiple manufacturers and the MIDI Manufacturers Association to standardize MIDI to a degree because it was already a standard language, but the problem was that if you got a Roland synth, program change 1 might be a piano, and on a Yamaha it might be a wacky synth sound, and on a sequential circuits thing it could be something else again. So General MIDI was a way of making them all conform. So even though the pianos may not sound the same, they would at least all be a piano if you loaded up program change 1. And all of these conform to that. So program change 25 is nylon guitar, 27 is electric guitar, etc. What we sometimes need to do, it may or may not happen in this case, is to go in and remove the program changes from the MIDI. So we're just going to do that. Now, if we open up this in the standard key editor, in fact, I'm just going to pop this out so we can see it a little more clearly. And just bring that up so we can see that a little more clearly. Now, in the controller lane at the bottom, if you click where it says pitch bend in this case, we can see with a little diamond what information is there. And one of the things here is program change. Now, this isn't really designed to do that. It's not a great editor. But if you only have the key editor, that's all you can do. But we can see we've got our program change information of 90 in here somewhere. But a much better way of looking at this is the list editor. So we go to MIDI and open list editor. And here we see all of the actual MIDI data which is in the part. So it's not necessarily a particularly musical representation of it, but it's really good for seeing the information that's happening. And if we scroll to the beginning of the part, we can see at bar 1, beat 1. So here we've got a block of information happening. We've got a program change here, which is program change 90, and that's how it knows which sound to use. And then we've got some controller information. So we've got controller 7, which is volume. We've got controller 10, which is pan, which is set to 64, which is central. So this will be panned in the middle. We've got controller 121, which resets all controllers. So it just says, you know, set everything to same defaults, etc. And we've got 91 and 93, which are reverb and chorus. So there's some reverb and a bit of chorus, but not so much. And then we've, at the beginning of the actual part, we've got controller 1, which is modulation, being set to 0. So there's a bunch of setup information here. And if we look in any of the other parts, so let's look at this in the list editor. Right back at the beginning, we see the same again, probably with the same settings for this particular one. You see we've got a different volume, but central pan, etc. We look at the next one. Again, back at the beginning. Greater volume, central pan. We've got some reverb, no chorus on the piano, etc. and so on. So we could look through all those. Now, all of those will be interpreted by Halion Sonic because it's in GM mode. But what happens sometimes, depending on the synth you're using, is that each time you play it, it would reset the sound back to the general MIDI one if you don't do what we're about to do. So let's say we want to upgrade the piano from the standard GM piano to something nicer in Halion Sonic. So what we'll do is we'll edit it here, and we can see the piano is on channel 3. So we're going to click on channel 3 there, and then let's pick the Yamaha S90 ES piano instead. So if I load that up, you can see it's loaded that there. Now, generally what won't happen in this case with Halion is it won't reload it back to the other one because it's intelligent enough to know that we don't want to do that. But occasionally what happens, and what happens with other synths, is it will go back to the synth that you had before. Now, another thing that sometimes happens is the program change maybe halfway through, because often what happened with older MIDI files, or when people were more excited, they would maybe change the sound in the middle. So maybe it would be piano for this first bit, and then it would change to honky tonk, etc. So there might be a program change at bar 9. So let's see what happens if you have something like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to open this up in the list editor. And then we're going to actually filter the notes. So I'm going to click hide for notes. So now we've got everything but notes in the piano part. So we can see we've got program change and controller changes, etc. at the beginning, and then nothing else. It's just notes. But what we're going to do is we're going to insert program change at bar 9 and see what happens. So here the insert is on program change. Put my pencil there, and then bar 9, program change. And I'm going to change that to 3 there. And then let's see if Halion Sonic, well, you can see it's changed to electric grand piano. So if I go back to bar 7, and I'm going to change it, you see it's changed back to acoustic grand piano. And then from bar 9, once we go there, you see it's changed to electric grand piano. So this is quite a common thing. It's not uncommon in MIDI files to see this, where it changes as the track progresses. Now, this can really stitch you up, because as you've noticed, I changed it to S90 ES piano. So let's just change it to that there. If we go back to the beginning, you see it's changed it to acoustic grand piano. So now we've got multiple changes in here. It's just going to keep changing it. So one of the things I've had commonly over the years, people like, my synth is haunted. It keeps just changing. And now you see there it's changed to GM003. So what you need to do is to remove the program changes from the parts if you want that to stop happening. So if you're going to change the sounds, obviously if you're going to leave them as they are, you don't need to do this. But if you want to change the sounds, you're going to need to do that. So we're just going to go in. And then in this case, you see I've still got notes hidden. And I could even hide controllers as well, because then we know we're just going to see the program changes, and you might see a few depending on where they are, but then we can just delete them like that. And now they're gone. So now we won't get any changes. So if we change to S90 ES piano, when we go back to the beginning, you see it's staying on that piano and it's not changing no matter where we get to. So that will always stick with that. So now we're sort of stuck with the Cubase way of changing sounds rather than using the General MIDI way. Now, something else which may cause you to scratch your head if you ever came across it is the way drums are done. So in the true General MIDI setup, channel 10 would be dedicated to drums. So if you sent it program change number 1, you would get a standard drum kit. And there were a few others, which I may put up on screen if I can find an appropriate graphic. And these would be the only program changes that they would respond to. But if you're eagle-eyed, you will notice that the drums here are GM129. And you may notice that that's not actually a valid program change. But this is a bit of a bodge, which I've seen a few places, but particularly, say here, where if it's importing it and it's on channel 10, it kind of maps it to a new set of program changes. Now, if we go and have a look in the list editor here, we'll see that our program change is number 1, even though it's ending up being 129. So don't be surprised by that. If it's on channel 10, it's supposed to be drums, not a piano, and it will change appropriately. So that's just one of those little things. So you'll see that as well as stereo drum kit. In fact, if we do GM here, we can scroll down and we can see that as we go down, so we get hip hop, jazz, percussion, R&B, rock, techno, etc. So there are some various variations on there which kind of map to the General MIDI ones, etc. But it's that kind of thing. So these aren't actually valid program change numbers. You won't see those, but they will map it. So I think it was number 7 was jazz. It will be confounded by whatever I put on screen, but that kind of thing. So it just maps those. So that's why you won't see 129 here. You'll see 1, but it knows that that's supposed to be drums, and it sends a bit of a bodge to make that work. Now, what about changing to another synth? So this is reasonably straightforward. So let's say we wanted to change these two synths here, instead of being on Halion Sonic, sending them to another synth. Now that's reasonably straightforward. So we can just create a new rack instrument. So here I'm going to create a retrolog. It asks if we want to create a MIDI track. I don't want to because I'm going to use an existing one. So I'm just going to click cancel. And I'm going to load up Jupiter Pad because that's the right kind of sound for this. And then once I've got that in place, all I need to do is to change it so that this track here gets sent to the retrolog. And that's done in the inspector. So in the top section of the inspector, which you may need to expand to get to. And then here we pick retrolog MIDI, and I'm going to make sure we're on channel 1. May not be a problem, depending on how the retrolog's set. But now, if we solo that, we're being played back on retrolog, and you'll see the MIDI light up. So if we open that up, we can see it's being sent MIDI, but it doesn't sound quite right. Sounds a bit wacky, a bit too wacky, and the reason is that the pitch bend range is wrong. So the default for General MIDI is 2 either way, and this is set to 3. So we're just going to decrease that. So it's -2 and +2. And now that will sound sane. Now, one thing you may have noticed is that retrolog isn't changing sound. The reason being that retrolog doesn't respond to MIDI program changes. So it's ignoring that message from the warm track. Now we want to do the same thing again. So we're just going to have another rack instrument because we've got a warm echo. So exactly the same process. Let's load up a Jupiter Pad. Change that to 2 each way. And then send warm echo to retrolog. Let's solo that. And we can see it responds to MIDI even though it's on a different channel. So fortunately, retrolog doesn't care what we're sending it on. And then when we've got the two together, we'll hear that echo. So we're getting that echo effect, which is one of the things that, better MIDI programmers would do. They would program things like delays, etc., by using these kind of techniques. Now, the last thing we were going to look at is to move from doing any mixing, whether via MIDI volume or just using the sliders in Halion Sonic. We're going to move to using Cubase's mixer as it gives us more functionality, etc. So we're going to look at enabling multiple outs. This has been covered elsewhere on the channel, but I'm just going to cover it here because this is the example we're using, and it never hurts to do things again. Probably do it totally differently to how to do it elsewhere anyway. So you can see we've got the rack here fully expanded. If your rack is narrow, you won't get all the controls. You click that and you get activate outputs, but I'm just going to make it wider, which gives us the same thing, but I generally don't have the right zone on, so it's on my Mac, it's Command Alt R. I think it's Control Alt R to get rid of it and toggle it back on the PC. So make it wide and then hide it when you're not using it. And I'm going to click Activate Outputs and turn these on. So if we look in the mixer, we will see that at the moment, our Halion Sonic has got just one output at the moment, just HSSE main. All of the sounds come out through that. So if we kill those solos, solo just Halion Sonic, we can see they're all on this one fader. And I can only do individual mixing. Yes, I can get into sending MIDI volumes, but that's a whole other bucket of worms that we don't want to open up right now. So what we want to do is to turn on multiple outputs, and we're going to do that here. So click that, and then I'm just going to tick all outputs. I'm going to turn them all on. We're going to use most of them. So there you go. They're all turned on now. When we go into Halion Sonic, we can then go to the mix page. And then for all of the active channels, so 16 isn't on, but all the others are, we're going to set them. So main is effectively 1. The next one we're going to set to 2 and 3 and so on. So now when this plays back, instead of having that, all the audio is in one track kind of vibe, we've now got all of these individual outputs, which will turn on. And we can see, we'll get them out of different channels here. Now, they're not, that's not going to work, but the others are. So here we've got just our piano there, bass, etc. And you can name them appropriately and so on to make your mixing life a bit easier. And there's other things you can do which are covered in the other video on the channel. But that then means that you can actually mix them, you can start EQing, etc. And now I know you can do quite a bit of work from inside Halion Sonic, but it makes a lot more sense to me to do it all in Cubase. Once you've got that up and running. So that's the main steps of importing a MIDI track into Cubase and then starting to make some changes and improvements and getting that set up for the kind of programming you're probably going to want to do. So if you've imported a MIDI file from the internet, you'll probably find it will need some work in terms of the programming, but definitely will need some improvement in terms of the sounds, because nearly everybody has got better sounds than just those basic GM sounds available. And being able to do some real production with actual audio effects rather than having to rely on MIDI programming effect techniques, etc., will hopefully be able to take a fairly mundane MIDI file and take it to the next level and make it sound pretty good. So as ever, I hope you found this useful, and if you have, please, like, comment, etc. And if you haven't subscribed, please consider doing so. And we'll see you again soon for more Music Tech Tuition.